And then the other significant piece is that trauma that happens within the family, when perpetrators, for example, are family members and parents, caregivers, that adds a different dimension to the nature of the trauma, which needs a very different kind of treatment than, let's say, working with shock trauma. Many people's lives, and they are, what ends up happening is that they reject and hate and criticize themselves, and then they feel bad about themselves for doing that, and it can be this endless loop of difficulty. And so
How would you explain that from a NARM perspective, and what would be an early sign that something is beginning to shift?
but then in NARM language, we as human beings develop certain strategies because it's painful to live with shame and guilt. And so we then compensate for that by trying to be perfect, flawless, beautiful, successful, all of these things. Now, those behaviors can come from different dynamics, but that's not an uncommon one.
Willkommen zu unserem Expertengespräch mit meinem Gast, Dr. Laurence Heller. Er ist Gründer des NeuroAffective Relational Model NARM, eines einheitlichen systemischen Ansatzes für die Arbeit mit Entwicklungsproblemen und Entwicklungstrauma und Schocktraumata. NARM ist ein ressourcenorientiertes, psychodynamisch fundiertes Modell, das die Arbeit im gegenwärtigen Moment betont. Dabei nutzt NARM somatische Achtsamkeit, um das Nervensystem neu zu regulieren und Identitätsverzerrungen wie geringes Selbstwertgefühl, Scham und chronisches Selbsturteil nachhaltig zu verändern. Dr. Heller hat mehrere wegweisende Bücher veröffentlicht. Du kennst sicherlich einige, denn die sind Klassiker. Darunter Healing Developmental Trauma, Deutsch Entwicklungstrauma heilen, dann The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma, auf Deutsch Entwicklungstrauma heilen, das Praxisbuch bzw. sinngemäß der praktische Leitfaden sowie The Workbook for Healing Developmental Trauma. Außerdem ist er Co-Autor von Crash Course, einem anderen Leitfaden zur Selbstheilung nach traumatischen Ereignissen und speziell nach Autounfällen, der in mehreren Sprachen erschienen ist. Und im deutschsprachigen Raum ist auch Befreiung von Scham und Schuld mit Angelika Doerne vielen Leserinnen und Lesern ein ganz wichtiger Zugang zum Thema Scham geworden. Ganz aktuell erscheint 2026 sein neuestes Buch Healing Shame and Guilt, The Developmental Roots of Chronic Shame and Guilt and How the NeuroAffective Relational Model NARM can help you heal and reconnect. Ich kann nur sagen, ich habe das Manuskript im Vorfeld zu unserem Interview erhalten. Es lohnt sich mehr. Es ist eigentlich ein Must-Have, dieses zu kaufen. Darin stellt er Scham und Schuld als zentrale, oft übersehene Dynamiken von Entwicklungstrauma noch einmal neu und präzise in den Mittelpunkt. Dr. Heller spricht mehrere Sprachen und führt seit vielen Jahren Seminare im NARM-Ansatz sowie Schulungen in Somatic Experiencing in zahlreichen Ländern Europas und darüber hinaus durch ebenso wie in den Vereinigten Staaten. Er war an mehreren großen Universitäten in der Lehre tätig und hat Kurse und Seminare an medizinischen Fakultäten, in Krankenhäusern und Schmerzkliniken in den USA und Europa gehalten. Zudem war er Mitbegründer des Gestalt Institutes of Denver und später des Rocky Mountain Psychotherapy Institute, wo er hunderte psychiatrische Fachkräfte ausbildete. In den letzten 2 Jahrzehnten hat er außerdem tausende Therapeutinnen und Therapeuten in den USA und Europa beraten. Und wir haben ihn jetzt zu Gast und lade dich dazu ein, ihn ganz herzlich zu begrüßen. So, welcome to this professional deep dive talk. My guest is today Dr. Laurence Heller, the creator of NARM in German, or NARM in English, the NeuroAffective Relational Model, and the author of several books on developmental trauma. Today, we'll put a clear spotlight on his new book, Healing Shame and Guilt, because it reframes shame and guilt as core dynamics in a completely new way. Dr. Heller, thank you for being here and a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you. It's very nice to be with you today.
Thank you. Well, let's start at the beginning with language. In my work, people rarely come and arrive using the term developmental trauma, but they come with, for example, harsh self criticism or relationship stress or inner restlessness or the feeling something is absolutely wrong with me. Dr. Heller, what is developmental trauma in plain language, and how can we recognize it in everyday life without relying on a diagnosis?
Well, sometimes it's really fairly obvious in many people's lives when they've grown up in profoundly neglectful or abusive situations, for example. Sometimes in difficult situations like wartime, not so far from the German borders right now, for example, and many other areas in the world. So growing up, and then also, but then there's more of the kind of the everyday dynamics where you grow up in a family where there's chronic misattunement or a feeling of a dark, heavy feeling that, the parents have been carrying into the relationship. There are very many different gradations of developmental trauma, from extremely severe to, not that severe, but still enough to create symptoms like some of the ones that you mentioned, and just life difficulties. And again, you touched on a very important point, because the one of the primary symptoms is, just as you mentioned, this chronic shame, guilt, self-hatred, self-rejection, self-judgment, self-sabotage. We know these are very powerful dynamics in many people's lives, and they are, what ends up happening is that they reject and hate and criticize themselves, and then they feel bad about themselves for doing that, and it can be this endless loop of difficulty. And so there's a whole range of symptoms that we could put under the big label of developmental trauma. I guess maybe just one last thought that occurs to me related to your question is, there's an important distinction between working with shock trauma, single incident trauma, in other words, versus developmental trauma. And developmental trauma, as opposed to single incident shock trauma, developmental trauma tends to be chronic. So it tends to be often an everyday kind of dynamic. And in many cases, it's all a person knows. If they grew up in a very dysfunctional family, for example, everyone attacking, fighting, there's a whole, the human suffering has a lot of many different aspects, but the chronicity of it is one of the significant pieces. And then the other significant piece is that trauma that happens within the family, when perpetrators, for example, are family members and parents, caregivers, that adds a different dimension to the nature of the trauma, which needs a very different kind of treatment than, let's say, working with shock trauma.
Thank you. I often see people function on the outside, but on the inside, they feel constantly tense or disconnected. How would you explain that from a NARM perspective? And what would be an early sign that something is beginning to shift?
Well, children become symptomatic at very early ages, and often, uh, particularly in previous generations, a little less so currently, but that many of these symptoms were unrecognized, and parents either didn't have the awareness or the time or the space to recognize them, or they just didn't have the capacity to recognize them. So
Mhm.
I've worked with people, for example, who grew up, the way they would get to sleep at night as a child was banging their head against the wall repeatedly. And their parents knew about this, and they might say, oh, they're just going through a phase, and they that would be it. Now, I don't think that would happen as much these days because people are more psychologically sophisticated. But these kinds of dynamics where significant, uh, emotional distress is not really recognized, and that's part of the chronic misattunement.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes. So the missing consciousness also on the side of the of parents is playing an really deep and heavy role, I guess. Mm.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And sometimes even, well-meaning parents
Mhm.
don't, there's a whole different dynamic in kind of the current generation than when we saw 20 years ago, for example,
Mm.
in that you've got parents trying to be the perfect parents these days because they've read many books and they know, and they maybe they've done some of their own personal work, but it can easily be hijacked into, to be a perfect parent, I have to have a perfect child. And so that any difficulty that the child has experienced is then experienced by the parent as a blow to their own self-esteem because they're trying to do it perfectly. So there are a lot of traps. Parenting is not an easy profession,
Oh,
and there
yes.
are a lot of traps that
No way.
yeah,
No way. Yes.
no
And,
way. Well, right.
it's really,
So the Go ahead.
yes,
Mhm.
sorry.
No, I was
Mhm.
just
Yeah,
finishing
I
something.
just have a thought because you talked about, yeah, perfect parents and perfectionism in, yeah, in behavior, um, towards the children, but perfectionism could be a sign of shame, isn't it? That's really not
Yeah,
funny, but it's really
no.
interesting dynamics. Yes.
Yeah, in NARM, I talk about identifications and counter identifications. So if a person feels very flawed or feels like their self-worth is based on how they look or how they perform, there's a lot of shame underneath that these shame-based deeper identifications. But then in NARM language, we as human beings develop certain strategies because it's painful to live with shame and guilt. And so we then compensate for that by trying to be perfect, flawless, beautiful, uh, successful, all of these things. Now, those behaviors can come from different dynamics, but that's not an uncommon one.
Mhm. Thank you. Before we go deeper into shame and guilt, I'm really
Mhm.
curious about the path that brought you to there. How did you personally and professionally get into developmental trauma? Was there maybe a turning point where you realized the field needed something different? Or, yeah, happened something personal in your life?
Oh, of course, I think it always starts that way.
Mm,
So, for example, one of the important elements in my development and my life was
mm,
again something that no one could really help on one level, which was that I had a father who was chronically ill off and
mm,
on. It wasn't like a constant thing, but over the course of my childhood, he had to deal with many medical problems. And even though I really did have a very supportive and attuned mother, but her energy was being taken with his illnesses, and in a certain way, his illness sucked all the oxygen out of the room.
Aw.
And so, and left a kind of gap in me in terms of not having he wasn't available to be the kind of father that I had hoped for, or even if it wasn't necessarily conscious, but that I felt like I was missing. And so, doing my own personal work,
Mhm.
exploring many different over years, not just dabbling in things, but exploring many different systems. Initially, was started with my own, did start with my own personal work, and then as I decided this is something that I want to spend my life doing, which I actually
Mhm.
I made that decision fairly early on because the whole process of my own work and then seeing other people's work
Mm.
became fascinating to me. I got the credentials that I needed educationally and all of that.
Mhm.
But I was always then very interested in a whole variety of different ways of working with people. And I noticed being exposed in depth to many different significant systems at that time, I saw some things that were extremely helpful, but in every system that I worked in and with, I also saw areas where people were really being missed, or where people were being pathologized,
Mm.
or where there was,
Mm.
for example, so much interpretation on the part of the therapist,
Oh,
which
yes.
is a
Yes,
mixed bag, let's say.
unfortunately, yes. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for your trust and your openness to talk about it. Um, what moment in real sessions shaped your thinking most?
Well, it's actually one of what I believe the contributions that NARM has made is that uh, it wasn't so much in the session as much as at the very beginning of the session.
Mhm.
Traditionally, therapists took a history,
Mm.
they would use that history, and then out of that, and they would then create some kind of treatment plan
Mhm. Yes.
based on
Mm.
and the history and sometimes the symptoms that a person had, without ever really inquiring within themselves and with the client themselves, like what is driving these symptoms. Now, of course, sometimes that did happen, but I've made that in the NARM work. I've made that a very explicit part of how we begin the process.
Mm.
We want to know, for example, what it is that the client is most wanting for themselves. And the strange thing is that that's a question that is not always asked, and sometimes often not asked. What is it that they're really looking for?
Mm.
Then part of the shift that I was experiencing is that rather than to try and get a person from A to B becoming goal oriented, let's extinguish these maladaptive behaviors. Let's try
Mm.
and manage the anxiety or manage the depression. I wanted to know what's driving it. So instead of becoming goal oriented, it became more inquiry and exploration oriented
Mhm.
and not making assumptions about the client, letting them, my expertise became how can I help the client become more familiar with their own internal world, their own internal conflicts, their own internal strengths as well. And that was another part of the development of NARM, not just focusing on where people are struggling and suffering, but the strengths that they've developed in order to deal with the adversity in their life that they've experienced.
Mhm. Yes, and when someone develops a model over decades, the lens often matters, right? When you're looking across the years, what has changed the most in how you understand trauma and healing, and what has remained consistent?
Oh, that's a very broad question that could be answered in a variety of different ways.
Yes.
Um, well, one of the things that we know, even though I have a different orientation, than in many models to personal history. But we do know, of course, that a person's personal history is, and what they experienced is very important. Freud knew this
Oh, yeah.
120, 30 years ago, whatever it was, and so,
Yes.
but what I saw about that, and that's what's changed, is that it isn't so much what happened to us as children, but the adaptations that we made to what happened to us.
Mm.
And that has a lot of implications because there is this idea, it's in the movies, but you also see it among therapists too, is that if we just find out what happened, then we'll know, then they'll get better. And then they'll be, and that, as we know, is not
Yes. Actually,
often the
yeah.
case.
Mm.
And what we know intellectually and
Mhm.
cognitively is only a first step or a minimal usefulness. So I started focusing really on the adaptations that people made. And I tried to kind of distill organizing principles in this broad area of psychotherapy where there are many different systems, many different kinds of understandings. And so one of the things that I discovered is that all of the so-called traditional defense mechanisms, which were categorized by Hannah Freud 100 years ago, approximately, that really they all revolved around the theme of disconnection and not feeling in one form. So then I looked at all of these various so-called defense mechanisms that Anna Freud
Mhm.
and then developed and were in use before her and then were expanded upon after her. And I saw one common theme, and they all had to do with disconnection
Mm.
and and an attempt not to feel.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and so it became very important for me to focus on the various ways that we as human beings have disconnected. And you may be interested to know, or maybe you already do know, that the original title of my very first book on healing developmental trauma was actually called Connection,
Oh,
Our Deepest
really?
Desire. And
You
yeah,
mean this one? Yes.
yeah, yes, yeah.
Yes.
It was disconnect, or no, connection, our
Mhm.
deepest desire and greatest fear.
Ah.
Now, the publishers, the first publishers of the book,
Mhm.
I see that you've got the German version there, the Kizel
Yes,
uh,
yeah, it's
uh,
German. Mhm.
edition,
Yes.
but the Random House in the United States, who now Kizel is connected to, but Random House suggested that that was not a good title. Oh, there we go. Emotionally, I was attached to that title, and I still use it in my teaching.
Mhm.
But they were right in terms of a marketing perspective. And so the original title then was Connection, Our Deepest Desire and Greatest Fear. Now, the desire, the impetus, and the impulse for connection is deeply wired in us as human beings. We're social beings. We're wired for attachment and connection. But when we experience chronic adverse childhood experiences, we disconnect in order to survive, in order to manage our internal experience and sometimes our external experience. And it's that disconnection that I saw was so important for us to know how to work with. And you don't work with disconnection just by digging into history. The disconnection is happening in people's lives. It's happening in the therapeutic session itself. So I moved from being a more psychodynamic, well, I still am very psychodynamically informed
Mhm.
in my work, but really the work is moment to moment and it's body based in NARM, in
Yeah.
the sense that
Mhm.
I reference the body in a regular way before this word embodied became so common in our culture, which is a good thing. But I was talking about the importance of that for a
Mm,
long time. And of course, I was trained in many of the older bodywork methods and I saw the limitations of those bodywork methods where there was a focus on regression,
mm,
catharsis,
mm,
um, and in that direction. And I
mm.
saw that that wasn't what was helpful in
Yes.
most cases anyway.
Mm,
Not that some people, of course, might have been helped by some of that, but to be consistent and particularly to be helpful to those people who've had early trauma, that kind of catharsis and regression actually often, in my experience, made things worse. So I started building in these elements from different traditions, taking what I thought was the most useful from various traditions and bringing that into my work. And so we in NARM, my teachers and my the participants in my trainings are taught how to track the body on a moment by moment basis, specifically for disconnection, because in the NARM model, the body is the mechanism of disconnection. And even if we're not psychotherapists, we know that instinctively. We know that when we're anxious, we hold our breath, we tighten our muscles. We know that when we do that chronically, we move into collapse. So that we see if we don't involve the body in the narrative, we're missing a very important piece. It has a tendency, the work has a tendency to stay very cognitive if you don't know how to effectively bring the body into the psychotherapeutic narrative.
mhm, mhm. Yes. So in my experience too, is actually the same. I'm a trauma survivor too, so I'm affected by developmental trauma also, and yeah, my personal work, um, yeah, showed me exactly the same yeah, recognitions, but also the experiences in the body, because I'm doing body work, somatic work for nearly 20 years. Yes, and this kind of disconnection, the experience of disconnection, um, did you experience it too? So you personal, you in person?
In some ways, of course, yeah. I I always had even as a child, I knew what people were feeling. I thought everybody did that.
Mhm.
So I wasn't disconnected on some level, but in terms of knowing the depths of some of the emotions, the unresolved emotions that I was carrying around, yeah,
Mhm.
that was out of my awareness and only became fully aware of, or maybe fully is too strong a word, but increasingly aware of was over the course of time and doing my own personal work. And then in the process of working with other people, because I was in private practice for over 30 years, um, and then as a teacher, seeing how effective that was, that what an effective impact that had on people to work with this process of connection and disconnection. And interestingly, in NARM, then, when we work in the here and now with this connection disconnection dynamic, as people become increasingly connected, the unresolved material from their childhood and their past tends to surface automatically. We don't have to go on what I call archaeological expeditions to try and dig up what exactly happened. And then the person, if we know what exactly happened, then they're going to be okay because we know that just doesn't
Yes.
work
Yes.
in most cases anyway.
Yeah, yeah. I have a client, and she
Mhm.
told to me nearly 2 or 3 months ago, um, Florist, I want back my dissociation because, and it happened after nearly 3 years, because it happened exactly the procedure to her what you have described. And then comes coming emotions and memories, also somatic memories, to the higher levels. And then they are not always just nice, but sometimes they suffer in the body, or hypervigilance and so on. And that was a jokey message from her, but it describes exactly that procedure, that path, what you explained. Yes.
Well, in I think in the very first book, and then in other places in other books, I talk specifically about the challenges of reconnection, just for some of the reasons that you mentioned. But it's not just painful feelings that also come back, is that sometimes the expansion and the vulnerability that comes with being reconnected is also something that people need to learn how to work with and to manage and to be present to. So it isn't, and of course, as you said, there are also painful emotions that often surface as people start to feel more, as people start to reconnect, and all of these elements need to be addressed in an effective therapeutic process.
And another signal of healing is, in her case, or showcase, that she's often just on crying and no idea why. This is also one of these happenings, and she just can realize that all these tenses in the body just can release, and it's getting better, getting better, getting better. Yes, yes.
Yeah, and in NARM, there's what I talk about as the NARM emotional completion process, and it's working with these emotions because often, just as you described, people don't even have words for it or know what it's about. And sometimes these emotions are actually default emotions. In other words, they're using one emotion in order not to feel a more significant emotion that's underneath. But sometimes it's just the feeling of coming back home to themselves is very moving, and so there can just be an emotional release. But it's important in my approach that we understand that all emotions are not created equal, that some emotions are much more useful in terms of this emotional completion dynamic than other emotions. As we all know, that there are some people who, no matter what they're actually feeling, what they are aware of is anger. And then there are other people who are the other side of the spectrum. Uh, no matter what they're feeling, they start to cry. And so, yeah, as therapists, we've all had, had experience. We've experienced that. And so it's important then for us to help the client to be able to identify, is this a very easy emotion for you to go to? Or is this new territory? Because we're always looking for the possibility of helping the client experience new territory within themselves, a new range of and different and development of different capacities to feel, to be embodied, to be present, to be relational. The relational piece is also as that's the R in NARM, and it's also a very important part of the whole process.
Mhm. Thank you. Well, next, I'd like to use your books as simple
Sure.
milestones for the listeners. Um, namely the first one.
Hmm.
Then I've got here the practical oriented edition of the
Hmm.
same. And I've got here the second one with Angelika Doerne. I know her
Hmm.
personally, yes.
On shame
Um,
and guilt, yeah.
yes, yes.
And
And
another book. Yeah, go ahead.
and your new book, yes, of course. Well, in Healing Developmental Trauma, so in German, Entwicklungstrauma heilen, you lay the foundation. What was the key message back then, and what would you emphasize most strongly today with everything you've learned up to 2026? Yeah, for example, which idea from that book is still underestimated? Yes, it could be also ein just yeah, an important topic to that. Or where has your language or framework sharpened since then?
Well, I think there are certainly, because I think that I started writing that book about 18 years ago, something like that, with Aline Lapierre.
Mhm,
And well, no, I started on my own, and as we talk about in the forward, I tried it a couple of times on my own. I was able to complete it with her help,
mhm,
and then and there are some things in there that, like even some of the sessions that I did, 15 years ago, that I would do differently now.
mhm.
Uh, although, it isn't that thought that it was a bad session. It's just that my focus is a little bit different these days than it might have been there in some areas. But what has gotten increasingly refined in my understanding is what I talk about now in more current books, which is the core dilemma
Mhm,
that we as human beings experience, which is this dilemma as a child when you're growing up in, uh, uh, let's say, a situation that we would describe as, involving developmental trauma. What children experience is this core dilemma between the feeling that they can either have attachment or they can be authentically themselves, but they can't have both. And that then, by necessity, children have no choice, they have no agency,
yes.
but by necessity, they have to give up what's most authentic and real in them, and many of the mechanisms by which they do that are bodily based, but not all of them. I mean, they're psychobiologically based is the word that I like to use, because they involve both, identifications as well as bodily processes. But this core dilemma that humans, and we as human beings experience, has become really a strong focus in my work, and the implications of that for us as adults, for us who have children, for us in terms of working with clients. When you start to see this dynamic and how it plays out in our lives so consistently, uh, I would say that that's one of the things that's gotten increasingly sharper and clearer in my work over these couple of decades.
Mm. Oh, I see. Okay. And then you brought you brought shame and guilt much more directly into the center. In liberation, so that's this one, in liberation from shame and guilt. This is actually your earlier shame and guilt book um, and work. What was the core intention, and what did it set the stage for the healing shame and guilt takes even further?
Well, what Angelika and I tried to do in that book was to really address it to the everyday reader. That's why we have lots of stories in that book of the different struggles, and also how to help people when they've been stuck in chronic shame, chronic guilt, chronic self-rejection, self-judgment, and so on. And so it was really an orientation, more so than my previous books, towards the general public. Of course, I've gotten feedback from a lot of clinicians who've read it and found it helpful too. But so that was a difference there. That was my first foray into really trying to address the general public.
Mhm. Yes, and yeah, what a luck that you've done it, I guess.
Well,
Yes,
thank you.
yes. Um, who is book two? So this one, four, and who is book three, best four? So, well, your new book.
The new. Okay, well, I'll go to book two first. That one is really, again, it's for educated lay people, and many of those have bought them, but it was really for clinicians. It was the practical or clinical guide, depending on the translation, but it's the practical and the clinical guide for helping therapists and individuals um, learn how to work with themselves or work with their clients in a more effective way, and how to apply some of the understanding that I developed in the first book into clinical interventions. So it's really very much oriented on how to do it. That's why it's practical, and that's why it's clinical. How do we not just understand these dynamics, but how do we work with them?
Yes, the most important puzzle, actually. Yes. Okay. Um, this this text, this talk, that brings us now to the new book and the sentence that really stopped me in your new book. Thank you for yeah, for the version in official, to be able to read it. And in healing shame and guilt, you say, chronic shame and guilt are not emotions, they are processes. What is absolutely new about that, and what does it change in real life and in the therapy room?
Well, the implications I think are quite significant, and they're ultimately related to the core dilemma that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Because one of the things that children do in order to protect the attachment relationship with the parent or the primary caregivers is that there's several aspects to it. But uh, if you think about it from a child's perspective, it's better to be the unlovable child of parents who have the capacity to love than a child who's lovable, but to then see that their parents don't have the capacity to love them for who they really are, to love them as they are. And so the adaptation then, and this is the beginning of shame and self hatred and all these things, is to take on the sense of the bad self, the unlovable self,
Mm,
to protect the image of the parents as being
mhm,
kind and good and loving. Because if the parents don't have the capacity for love from a child's perspective, there's no love in the universe, and
mhm,
that's catastrophic. If
mhm,
you take on the self-image of being bad, defective,
mhm,
imperfect, wrong, the list could be very long, but all of
yeah,
those things, you see, there's something that you get out of that, which is that then you can make yourself better, then you can become lovable. But if
mhm,
there's no love in the universe, there's no hope. So
yeah.
it addresses that dynamic, and really a lot of the book that Stefan Niederwieser and I did in this most recent book on shame and guilt is to really go into the details of that.
Mhm, mhm. In your opinion, what's the most common mistake when people treat or try to treat shame as just a feeling?
Well, they miss the fact that there's agency in that in that process. That's why it's not an emotion. It's a process. Shame as adults, not as children, but shame as adults, and all of the associated elements that we've talked about, are things that we now as adults do to ourselves. We shame ourselves. We reject ourselves. We criticize ourselves. Now, that isn't blaming the victim. it's helping them free themselves from that pattern, which is just the opposite of blaming them. And I use a word in English, which is agency, which is a very difficult word to translate into German.
Oh, yes.
So, so I mean, I know people have tried Selbstwirksamkeit and so on and so forth,
Yeah.
but mostly all my German teachers and students, we always just end up using the English word agency because there isn't a good translation in
Mhm,
German.
mhm,
But the important thing is that it's a process, and it's something that we can't switch on and off like a
mhm,
light
mhm,
switch,
mhm,
but we can have impact
mhm,
on how we orient and see and relate to ourselves.
mhm,
And in doing that, we're addressing the core dilemma, because you see, self-hatred and all the others related elements are one aspect of that core dilemma, that there's something basically wrong with me, that I'm not lovable, that I deserve to be punished for
mhm,
whatever.
mhm, mhm. Oh, yes. Um, I I wonder, how do you distinguish healthy shame or guilt from chronic shame and guilt? Just in a plain language again. Mhm.
That's actually very simple. No, it
But
is.
I
I'm
guess
not
not for
joking.
everybody.
Well, no, not for. Well, I can
Yeah.
do it. I usually can just deal with that in like a minute or two. Because basically, we know that there are people who have no shame.
Mhm.
And on the extreme end of that spectrum, we talk about those people as sociopaths or psychopaths because they don't have the capacity to feel shame.
Mhm.
So healthy shame and healthy guilt simply means that we have the capacity for empathy, that
Mhm.
we can, people are not just objects to be moved around or to
Mhm.
meet your needs. They're independent beings in their own right. And if we do something objectively that's hurtful, we can feel shame, and from that sense of, oh, it's shame and regret maybe about something we said or did, and then we can try and repair that with that person.
Mhm.
But if you have no, and that's healthy, but most of what we're dealing with in terms of shame and guilt as adults is not that. It's the toxic or chronic shame and guilt that comes from uh, really generally the core dilemma as we've been discussing.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes, and this is where my own practice observation and my own experience too comes in, because people rarely call it shame. Why are shame and guilt so often the hidden core of developmental trauma, and why are they so well disguised?
Well, again, this process starts so early, and when it's all we know, we don't have the capacity to stand back and reflect on it. One of the things that happens as people do their work is they start to become aware of the price that they've been paying for what they didn't even know was shame and self-hatred and so etc. So that and the other thing too is that there has been an understanding in psychotherapy for many decades about introjection, because sometimes we just take on directly the shaming comments that our caregivers might have given us. Oh, you're the smart one. Your sister's the pretty one. Or even worse, things like "what an idiot," or
Mm,
parents saying, and I've heard this from clients, "I wish you'd never been born," or "you ruined my life," or I mean, the painful
yeah.
list of things that sometimes parents have said to children is very long, and we introject or take that in directly.
Mm,
But what has not been understood, and what Stefan and I are trying to do in this book, is to really show how shame and, again, all the related elements, self rejection and so on, are adaptive. And they're adaptive in terms of the core dilemma that I was talking about earlier, because they maintain the sense of badness in place, which on some level even though we're now adults, but in child consciousness, I don't use the word inner child, but in child consciousness, it feels like it protects us from the loss of the attachment relationship, which again, until we understand it, feels catastrophic to a child, continues to feel catastrophic as adults, but only as a kind of a vague dread. We don't think, oh, if I say no to this person who's making demands on me, not a parent, then I'm going to lose love, all the love in the universe. But that dynamic is what's going on underneath the surface. And
Mhm.
so, and there are different kinds of patterns of shame, and each one of the survival styles that I use is shame based. So some people feel like the very earliest kinds of trauma, people feel shame just at existing, taking up space, having having a body. They try to become invisible. In the next survival style, it's the feeling like it's shameful to have needs, so they end up taking care of other people's needs. In the third survival style, it's like it's shameful to be weak or vulnerable or open or whatever. And so they're going to be in control. They're going to be on top of things. They're going to be in charge. And then in the fourth survival style, the autonomy survival style, it's they feel shame and guilt when they say no, or they set limits, or they set boundaries. But underneath that shame and guilt is fear. If I if I say no to this person,
Mhm.
then I won't be loved. And it may or may not be. Some people are aware of that feeling, and some people just feel it and they're not aware of it. But that's
Mhm.
what's going on there.
Mhm.
And then with the love sexuality survival style, again, there are many different elements. I'll just focus on one, which is that feeling that their self-worth is dependent on how they look and how well they perform.
Mhm.
And when I talk about that, and again, it's so widespread in our cultures
Mhm.
that the and so much pain in all of that, because the more that we operate from that place, the more we reinforce our belief that we really have something to be ashamed of, that we really are
Yes.
defective, or we have no right to communicate our needs, or to set boundaries, or to take up space, all the
Mhm.
things that I touched
Mhm.
on.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. We have just mentioned already, yeah, just before, that there are several common masks of shame. One of this is perfectionism, and also people pleasing, control, withdrawal. And these masks are, yeah, mm, most of the time not conscious. Um, you have also mentioned that shame is actually a protection. Um, how does shame show up in the body? Maybe also as protection. Is it possible? Are we able just to recognize shame in the body as protection?
Well, there certainly is a body component to it, and again, it has to do primarily with contraction in
Mhm.
all of the systems of the body. The
Mhm.
muscular system is what's addressed more traditionally, but in my experience, it's that deep, depending on the kind of trauma and how early
Mhm.
and so on. But that contraction is not just in the muscular system, because that with the muscular system develops later. It can be in the visceral system, the central nervous system, so it can affect all of the organs of the body. And of course, the nervous system is connected to the endocrine system. And all of these systems are connected to brain chemistry. So we're really all one piece. And a very important part of NARM is I talk about the functional unity of body and mind, that we can't separate these elements out. We're all connected. And that's kind of like the opposite direction than modern medicine has been going on, with increasing compartmentalization, specialization. But we know, for example, and even in the very first book, many years ago, I talked about the profound autonomic dysregulation and even central nervous system dysregulation that happens with very early trauma. So all of this is held in the body, expressed in the body in the form of physical symptoms. So far I'm just talking about contraction. But there's another dynamic, which is that it's painful to be in chronic states of very high nervous system arousal,
Mm.
and then the default position there, or the protective position, is then to go into collapse
Mhm.
and shut down. And that can be a part of at least many different conditions, syndromes that we talk about,
Mm.
chronic fatigue and other kinds of
Yes.
whole body dynamics where
Yeah.
our whole bodily, all of our bodily systems are to, in one degree or another, dysregulated.
At this point, many listeners will maybe think, okay, what do I do when it hits me today? When someone notices I'm slipping into self criticism or perfectionism or self blame, what's a first concrete step from the new book that can be felt quickly?
Well, the first thing, it sounds basic, and it is in a certain way, is to recognize just that and to recognize that you're doing it to yourself. One of the things that most therapists, for example, recognize is eventually, at least, and hopefully sooner rather than later, is that our most traumatized clients are generally present with very negative self-talk, self-hatred, self-judgment, all of these dynamics. And they're doing it to themselves. They've internalized it, or it's part of the adaptation that they've made, or combinations of that. And so to help them become aware of it,
Mm.
the hope is, as we begin to address that with the client in non-judgmental
Mm.
ways, and in a communication style that communicates acceptance just as you are with whatever it is that you're bringing, that the client becomes increasingly aware of just how hard they are on themselves,
Mm.
just how, and there again, you see, there's agency, and they're hard on themselves. They
Yes.
judge themselves. They
Yeah.
beat up on themselves,
Yes.
and so to become aware that that's, see, that's why it's not blaming the victim. It's helping the victim free themselves from these old painful survival strategies that they've used for many years. And ultimately, in the course of the work, they begin to understand what are the roots of that. Why did I need to develop this self-rejecting dynamic in the first place?
Mhm.
And over time, as I've
Yes.
seen
Mhm.
thousands of times, literally,
Mhm. Mhm.
that changes.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, I see that the yeah, to become consciousness about all these dynamics is actually the key and the most maybe useful element for the yeah, for the survivors. What do you think?
Well, it's certainly the most important first step, because without that consciousness or that awareness developing, they just continue treating themselves in the way that they generally the way that they were treated, and they continue this painful dynamic, which is often intergenerational. Their parents treated them in the way that they were treated, and on back into history, so that, but they become aware of that, and then the adult self, the more developed self that
Mhm.
wishes themselves well and is more supportive, can come increasingly online and available to them,
Mhm.
particularly when they recognized that they weren't doing this, self-rejection
Mhm.
process perversely, that
Mhm.
in the beginning it was protective. They were trying to
Yes.
save their
Yes.
lives in
Mhm.
one way or another. And so that they can even forgive themselves
Mhm.
for developing that chronic shame and guilt and self-hatred, in general, because we can feel shame, and then we can shame ourselves for shaming ourselves, and that process can just couple together again.
Endless loop. I just
Endless
yeah,
loop.
endless
Mhm.
loop, yes. And yeah, there's another thing. You surely know the well-meant advices. They tend to reinforce shame. Do you have some examples for this?
The first example comes is it actually can be helpful is like if somebody says, "Oh, you don't have to blame yourself, or you don't have to be so hard on yourself."
Mhm.
That's actually it doesn't usually because it's just
Mm,
cognitive. It doesn't usually sink in, but
yes.
sometimes
Mhm.
it might. But and then you get all kinds of other things. Oh, you're just lacking this amino acid, or you're,
Mhm.
you need to practice forgiveness. You need to forgive the people who hurt you, or, yeah, I mean, there could be a very long list of advice that isn't really helpful that ends up, actually making the person feel worse, even though the intentions of a friend or a family member might have been, very,
Mhm.
the desire to help, let's say, but it doesn't help because it puts people into a deeper loop because it's not something that with the force of the will we can change. But through understanding and embodiment and emotional completion, we don't have the need to be so hard on ourselves. We don't have the need to judge ourselves constantly. We don't have the need to base our self-worth on how we look or how we perform.
Yes. And this topic brings us to a term that can be often misunderstood, but it deeply relieving when framed correctly. You emphasize agency just earlier too. How do you explain agency so it feels like empowerment, not it's your fault? And what are the inner signs that agency is increasing?
Here's one example. There are many different scenarios that are possible, but let's
Mhm.
say we've been working with the person for a few sessions and we've just addressed, for example, when and where and how exactly we do this
Mhm.
obviously depends on the client and their capacity and so on. But at some point, we address with them, just how hard they're being on themselves, or how, and sometimes I will even use the word because it's impactful. I say, well, that they're hating themselves
Mm.
and they're using
Yes.
hateful language. I'm so stupid. I'm so
Mhm.
ugly. I'm
Mm.
so, and I say, and to just to begin to name that.
Mhm.
And that's one piece. And then the other piece is the client is obviously always expecting that you're going to be just one other person who's judging them and rejecting them as like they do to themselves and as they experienced as children. And over time, this is where the relational piece in therapy becomes important,
Mhm.
is that they start to see you not as a threat, because people with the very earliest trauma tend to see other human beings primarily as a threat. And they start to see you, and then they might say, for example, I can see that you're not judging me, even though I'm telling you all these
Mhm.
terrible things
Mhm.
about myself.
Mhm.
And then we might say, yeah, you're right. I have no judgment.
Mhm.
Actually, it's painful for me to hear. And so there's a appropriate self-disclosure in NARM. We're human beings showing up in a relationship with the client, and we are always still thinking about how this is going to impact the child. I mean, impact the client. But um, the orientation is that we're bringing compassion and lack of judgment and acceptance, and that acceptance then translates into self-acceptance. And so, I've heard this kind of story many times. Is like after a series of some sessions, for example, the client comes in and says, I made this mistake, really bad mistake at work, and I was just starting to beat up on myself and be so hard on myself. And then I thought of you. And in older language, which is still very useful,
Yes.
that was in object relations theory, for example, that would be
Mhm.
called the interjected empathic
Mhm.
object. So
Mhm.
they're actually taking in the non-judgment and the acceptance that they're getting from you, and they're incorporating it in the literal sense of that word, embodying that
Mhm.
in their own process.
I can observe often a kind of inner resistance. What's the most common inner resistance, and how do you work with it when you
Well, the most
recognize?
common inner
Mhm.
resistance,
Mhm.
the most common inner resistance is they at that particular junction in time, they don't stop doing it. It's just whatever interventions that you might have used that may have had some impact, but you haven't yet addressed the core dilemma. And ultimately, it's the core dilemma that creates the major inner resistance, because for them, this is where it gets paradoxical. For them, for the client who's struggling with self-hatred, for example, that's been a way of protecting themselves from feeling alone, from feeling outcast, from feeling abandoned. And so um, we then, and one of the things then that we do in NARM is we work with, uh, you know, how frightening it is for them to begin to
Mhm.
accept themselves.
Mhm.
And we then explore with them. We don't tell them, we don't preach or anything like
Oh,
that,
yes.
but we explore with them,
Mhm.
what is it that's driving this
Mhm.
so-called resistance?
Mhm. Mhm.
Because I don't even use that word in NARM.
Mhm.
I talk about fear.
Mhm.
Usually that resistance is just one of the various form, what was
Mhm.
traditionally called resistance, is just one form of fear.
Yes.
I'm afraid that if I'm starting to be kind to myself, that I'm
Mhm.
going to lose, the parents
Mhm.
might be gone
Mhm.
for 20 years. I'm
Mhm.
going to lose my parents. I'm going to lose, or I'll be, it might, if it's in a work situation, then it might be thinking, if I say no, or if I set
Mhm.
limits, or if I ask for what I want, nobody's going to like me here, or everybody's going to turn against me. So it takes, it takes four different forms in different people's lives, depending on who they are and, their life situation. But
Mhm.
yeah, so I just explored the fear,
Mhm.
the fear of more that comes up for them, and as what has previously been child consciousness gets increasingly experienced from a more adult, embodied adult perspective,
Mhm.
they that's where change happens.
Mhm.
And there's always two steps forward, one step back, because for one thing, just even physiologically,
Mhm.
the more that we accept and forgive ourselves and uh, you know appreciate who we are as human beings, the more energy is available to us. And
Mhm.
just physiologically as well
Mhm.
as psychologically,
Mhm.
this can be challenging for people. These expansive states that come when people start to feel more them as themselves, show up more authentically, that they need to understand how that process works, and they need to learn how to be able to stay present in an embodied way to the expansion that comes with letting go. Not that we ever really let go. I don't like that expression, but as these old shame-based identifications dissolve, we'll put it that way, that as they dissolve, there's a freeing up of energy and life force for them that needs time on both psychological and physiological levels to be able to manage, and to be able to be present to, and to be able to live.
Absolutely. Um, just a last question to this
Mhm.
part of our talk. If someone has done lots of body work, but shame still remains, what does NARM do differently?
So are you talking about just somatic work, not somatic psychotherapies, but just body work, opening the body?
Um, oh, yeah.
Because
your,
there's
your
both.
question
There
begs.
are
Yes, I know.
there are
Yeah.
somatic
Yeah.
psychotherapies, and then there's just a whole Since I've been in this field, there's been the development of so many different somatic approaches, purely somatic
Oh,
approaches.
yes. Yeah. In the meanwhile,
Well,
yeah.
but you tell me if this answers your question. But the thing is that if you're just doing bottom-up work, which includes body work and nervous system work, you you can't address self-hatred simply bottom up. The bottom up piece is important, but it's only a part of the process because we need to work with the top down elements, the identifications that we have, the way that we relate to ourselves, and that whole relationship to self ultimately can change, but it will never change just through body work. And I've used body work and many different kinds of body work over my many years and found it very useful. And I also see its limitations.
Mm,
It can only help us so far. It
mm,
can help us access states in us that we might not have otherwise been able to access. But for us to be able to integrate those states, we need to work through the emotional conflicts
mm,
that have driven the the contractions and the
mm.
and the collapse and the shutdown and all of that, originally.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So many thanks for the first part, but now just two topics. They are traditionally to the end of my talks. So the first topic would be just a short um, word play. So it works um, that I say a word and you will respond in one or two sentences. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
I'm willing. This is the first time anyone's asked me or set this up, but
Okay.
I'm
Yeah.
curious, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we will see. Okay. So,
Mhm.
nervous system.
It's a term that's useful in some ways, but overused and becoming debased in social media and applied to everything. So, and the big confusion with narcissism is that it has to do with self-love. It's
Mm,
nothing like that. Narcissism, by definition, is self-hatred. What the person is in love with is the image.
mhm,
When they're in love with when they're focused so much on their image, they're rejecting what's deeper in themselves. So
mhm.
really, narcissism is a painful dynamic and has nothing to do with self-love. It has to do with self-rejection.
Right. Healing.
Well, let's just say that it's not an absolute term. I look at it as a process.
Mhm,
So there's on this continuum of healing, there is great process or no, sorry. In When we're talking about healing, there's a really a continuum and various steps and stages in the healing process. And healing for me has to do with coming back to a more seemingly paradoxical, more subjective sense, more in touch with our own subjectivity, with who we are, with what we feel, with our inner experience, and more capacity to be in relationship with others from this authentic place. So that's a very important part of the healing process. And I would also say that we as human beings, we're always works in progress. So that I don't see, I don't see healing as just some kind of absolute term that, oh, this person is completely healed.
Well, the next word is attachment.
Well, it's a concept that's strangely, it's been in our cultures for thousands of years. We've talked about bonding and in English, we use that word and the related German word. But the way that we understand attachment is in more in like the last 50 years. And, I won't go into the history of it, but in terms of the current understanding, we know how significant the process of attachment is in an infant's life. That every human being that's born onto this planet is looking for attachment in the same way that they're looking for oxygen. They don't have a word for it, but they know that they need it. The organism knows that they need it. And the child, the infant, the newborn, that needs attachment. They need a figure that they can have physical, emotional contact with, and eye contact in the attachment research that's been going on in the last 40 years or so has focused a lot on eye contact, which is important. And I think there's more to it than that. It's that they don't bring the body in enough, from my perspective, that attachment is also a bodily process, and the skin contact and physical contact is as important as eye contact, for example. But attachment is a basic human need, and when it's adequately met, it sets up a foundation for a healthier, happier life for people. And when when attachment is compromised in the various ways it can be compromised, it we as human beings pay up.
Okay, guilt.
Guilt, as opposed to shame, has more to do with feeling bad about something we've done, where shame is more basic. Shame has more to do with feeling bad about who we are. So it's, and we sometimes, of course, there can be an overlap between the two, but guilt tends to be, there are exceptions, but it tends to be a little easier to work with than shame, which is a much more fundamental dynamic.
Well, thank you very much for this topic, for this little play. And yeah, we come now to the end of our talk. And as the really very final question, if you can imagine
Okay.
that a fairy would visit you today and offered 3 wishes, what would they be? What would you wish?
Oh, really putting me on the spot here. So one of the wishes can't be, I wish that I could have all
No,
the
no, no,
wishes
no,
that I
no.
want. No, I'm just kind of joking here.
Mm.
'Cause that's usually considered cheating. Wishes? Wow. Well, it's kind of universal, but I would wish for
Mm.
an easier and more peaceful planet for us as human beings. That would be one wish. Um, I would wish for all of us as human beings to have more capacity for acceptance and heartfulness in our lives. We can cut out all this pause because I'm assuming, because I really want to give this last one some thought for a
Yes,
second.
maybe yeah, it takes
Um,
time. Not
mm,
every day come a fairy.
mhm.
Well,
And I guess I would wish for uh, worldwide
Hmm.
increasing compassion for both the beauty of being a human being and the incredible suffering that we have on this planet.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yes, for the wishes,
Hmm.
for this really deep talk with your openness, and
Hmm.
I wish you, I'm not a fairy, but I wish you that your new book, yeah, can heal a lot of people with shame and guilt. Yes. Thank you so much for being here. Yes.
Ja,
Wow.
es war ein großes Vergnügen, hier mit dir zu sprechen.
Ganz, ganz herzlichen Dank. Ja.
Gerne.
Thank you so much.
So,
Yeah.
okay. Well.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Okay.
So that was fun.